The nature of the city in the Gilded Age is different qualitatively and quantitatively from its predecessors. Particularly in the United States, there have been large cities in the United States, but they grew in many cases to significantly larger proportions over the course of the Gilded Age and into the 20th century. Cities grew because of the concentration of industry in them. Sometimes these cities were regional centers of specialized manufacturing. Sometimes they became also centers of finance and marketing. And smaller cities took on many attributes of the larger cities. One of the things you should keep in mind, however, that when we talk about cities, we use the Census Bureau designation of any place with definite boundaries that contains 2,500 or more people. For us today, that's a tiny little town. But in the Gilded Age and into the 20th century, that composed a city. And even towns as small as 2,500 people shared some of the issues that were shared by cities of substantially larger populations. Let's look at the physical geography of cities. Originally, cities, generally when they incorporated very specific boundaries. That is, they went to the state legislature, they received a certificate of incorporation, and this laid out a very specific area in which the city government could operate. So that formed the city. And these cities, throughout the early 19th century and into our period, were originally walking cities. Even large cities like New York or Washington, D.C., began with this idea of being a walking city. That is, they would be no more than 1.25 miles radius from the dead center of the city. That's about as far as you could walk. And places of business, places of manufacturing would be interspersed with residential areas, so that people who lived in a small part of the city rarely had to go very far. That is, these walking cities developed into neighborhoods. And as cities grew, for example, Washington, D.C. had been laid out to incorporate about 10 square miles. But even then, D.C., cities like New York, and by which we mean Manhattan, developed into neighborhoods, into cities of neighborhoods. You can see this if you go to a larger city that has some age on it, and note how it has grown by incorporating other little walking cities. This is particularly true in my own experience in Portland, Oregon, in which the city of Portland grew simply by incorporating other cities. Birmingham, Alabama did exactly the same thing in 1905, a little bit out of our immediate period. It doubled its population by incorporating all of the city-like area between it and Bessemer, Alabama. Atlanta has grown the same way, as have cities like New York City and to some extent Washington, D.C. With this mixing, or rather with this, with this mixing of residential area and commercial areas, you also ended up with a mixing of classes. The working class and the upper class and the middle class were not particularly well defined, and spatially it was in the Gilded Age that they began to define themselves by segregating themselves. and that's a phenomenon that we'll talk about. One of the the physical phenomena of cities is the appearance of new architectural form, particularly the skyscraper. Buildings prior to skyscrapers could not be excessively tall. They could only go up maybe 4, 5, potentially 6 stories, because all of the weight of the building was borne by central columns or outer walls. And the outer walls, usually made of brick, had to be thick, thick, thick at the bottom and became thinner at the top. But they also could not bear a tremendous amount of weight. Walls often blew literally outward. And if you look at old brick buildings, 2 and 3 stories today, if you can see the sides of these older brick buildings, you'll frequently see what looks like a plate on the outside of the building, sometimes a star shape, sometimes round, sometimes square, that looks like it has a bolt in the center of it. Well, that's exactly what it has. That bolt runs to the other side of the building and is a tie rod that ties the 2 walls together. And you may see a bunch of these things in the side of a building. Well, because of the cost of land in these old walking cities, in these neighborhood-based cities, the cities, once they started drawing large numbers of people, began building skyward. And this was made possible by the development in the 1850s and 60s, and then a great commercialization of steel. Steel made cheaply could hold a building together. In fact, it is the steel frame, also known as the Chicago skeleton, that made skyscrapers possible. Now, skyscrapers have a particular kind of architecture. Because the walls do not necessarily bear weight, they can be both lightweight and window-filled, as you see in the Tacoma building here before you, built in 1889 by the inventor of the skyscraper, George Fuller, in Chicago. Because the outside walls didn't carry the load, he could fill the outside walls with windows, which cannot bear load. All of the load of the building is carried on a steel frame, the Chicago skeleton. Buildings could rise higher than 10 stories. And it's Louis Sullivan, the architect, that developed in the 1890s an architectural aesthetic that changed the way we looked at downtowns, that changed the way we thought about downtowns, that changed the way people thought about buildings. And he is having written in 1896 about his aesthetic, and he popularized the slogan that I'm sure you've heard, that form follows function. The buildings had a particular function, particularly these 10-plus story office buildings that he and George Fuller and others were designing. And because of the function, they had particular forms. Remember that form follows function as we talk about another phenomenon in housing in just a moment. One of the things that happened with the development of skyscrapers is that pretty rapidly downtown cores of large cities became canyons of skyscrapers, which actually changed the weather patterns in the cities themselves, making them much windier and frequently hotter than they had been before. When people came to work in cities, they had to have some place to live. And a large majority of the people that flocked to the cities, whether they came from, and we'll talk about immigration later, whether they came from a foreign country to America, or whether they moved into cities for economic opportunity from towns, they had to have a place to live. I'd like you to look at the image, the smaller of these two images that's low and to the right. That's a Jacob Riis, R-I-I-S, photograph. Riis wrote, and we'll talk about this in the Progressive Era, he wrote How the Other Half Lives, and he is one of the first fully functioning photojournalists in American history. He photographed working class life, that is the other half. And this is one of his photographs of an older style of working people's housing. You can see that it's only a couple stories tall. These wooden buildings are dilapidated, bending in the middle. These are very old style tenements, and they gave way to tenement apartment buildings. In fact, the word tenement comes from these tall apartment buildings that replace this kind of dilapidated wooden housing. Now, tenements, much like sharecropping, tenements didn't start out to be exploitative, but they became exploitative very quickly. Many of the tenements landlords did all they could to pack as many people into these apartments as they possibly could. There was no effective building inspection. There was no effective fire inspection. And there were very few laws to support the rights of tenants to decent living conditions. Frequently, the interiors of the buildings and the courtyards of the buildings and the alleys between the buildings were so overcrowded that they just became dark, dank junkyards that were unsanitary and unhealthy to an extreme that we would consider to be pretty despicable, I guess. You see the tenement building on the left, the taller of these two images, and this is a newer style tenement, which we would call an apartment or a flat. And each floor, this is called a dumbbell tenement because of that narrow section, that narrow hallway in the middle. There's an apartment in the back, an apartment in the front on each floor, and they have carved out those areas next to that central stairway and hallway to allow air to circulate. Well, the unfortunate reality was these buildings often were packed closely together, and those ventilation chutes rarely functioned the way they were supposed to. They hardly ever let good amounts of air into the building, particularly on the lower floors. But once a fire started, they acted just like flues, just like chimneys, and they drew the fire upward into other apartments. So they actually had a deleterious effect. These buildings were not built well. They tended to not be maintained very well, and they frequently became squalid. Now, this is not just because of landlord neglect, though that was a primary reason. They were overcrowded, significantly overcrowded, and to a great extent, the people in them had been farm people and lived like they still lived on the farm. They also rarely had internal plumbing, and so waste management occurred in the backyards, which became a problem in and of itself. But frequently, this is the kind of building, the kind of urban working class housing that makes up so much of the residential areas of America's largest cities, whether it's Chicago, New York, Boston, Philadelphia, or even New Orleans. Because of the way the modern city developed, it began to develop a class structure. The commercial and industrial work sites were adjacent to teeming slums. And so those who could afford to frequently tried to move away from these areas that were developing into industrial and poor residential areas. What made it possible for the developing middle class to flee the old walking city was transportation, reasonably inexpensive transportation that would take them to residential only areas outside of the downtown core. These are frequently called exurbs. They're just outside uptowns. They're just outside of the downtown area. They're devoted to residential uses. Very few commercial uses would be allowed, even if there were not laws that protected the residential areas. And what made it possible to do this was the development of various kinds of streetcars. The streetcars developed. The picture to the left here is what we call a jitney. A jitney is a streetcar drawn by horses or mules, laid on track, and that for a nickel would take you uptown, take you out to the suburbs, the smaller cities that were primarily residential, or what we would call today bedroom communities. And then it would take the working members of the family back into the commercial or manufacturing core. Now, it cost a little bit of money to live out in the suburbs or the exurbs or uptown in the residential only area. The property prices tended to be a little more expensive, and you had to pay for daily transportation back and forth. Frequently, a nickel a day or a nickel each ride was just too much for poor folks to afford. So they stayed downtown, and the better off moved out to uptown or the suburbs. Streetcars developed in with the Chicago cable car, the first line of which was completed in 1873. Now, this is not like an electric streetcar. The cable car has a moving cable, like a ski tow, under the street, and the brakeman actually grabs hold of the moving line under the street. And that's why in San Francisco you frequently see that the streetcars don't ever really stop. You have to run and jump onto them because they continually move, because the brakeman only slows down. He doesn't completely turn loose and allow the streetcar to come to a complete halt. The inventor of the streetcar for San Francisco decided that he was tired of seeing horses slipping and sliding on ice and frost and wet hills in San Francisco. So he devised this system of bull wheels, pulleys, and underground lines to create a different motive force. In 1895, the Chicago elevated railway was the first line completed. It was completed out to the west side. And then the New York subway system completed its first line in 1904. 1 year later, New York City, with its various boroughs, was reincorporated into the city that we know today, and in large part because of the subway system that was developing there. In the picture to the right, you can see the number 4 and the number 5 train going under the East River in 1913. This concludes our short discussion of the city in the Gilded Age. Thank you.